The young millionaire Amelia Townsend discovers an elderly woman living in dire conditions in a rundown neighborhood. Something about the woman feels strangely familiar. From a casual conversation, a surprising revelation begins to emerge. The light rain tapped against the imposing windows of Amelia Townsend's apartment, creating a soft melody that filled the quiet space. She was seated in her favorite armchair, a glass of wine in hand, as she gazed at the gray city skyline. This had been her routine for some time, finding comfort in solitude and the calm of her own space. The young millionaire, with her perfectly aligned blonde hair and always impeccable attire, was the picture of the successful woman everyone admired. But inside, she felt a growing emptiness that seemed to deepen with each passing day. From an early age, Amelia had been taught to carry the weight of the Townsend family legacy, one of the most traditional and influential on the East Coast of the United States. Her father, Charles Townsend, always made sure to remind her of the importance of preserving the family name and keeping the image intact. She, as an only child, knew her responsibilities were immense. Her childhood was marked by strict protocols, education at the best schools, and a notable absence of genuine affection. The thought of her mother, who had passed away when she was just a child, always brought a pang of sadness. Amelia remembered little of her, only fragments of a sweet but distant woman whose hands gently stroked her hair the few times they were together. Her father rarely mentioned Amelia's mother, and the subject had become a silent taboo in the Townsend mansion. In recent months, Amelia had been dedicating herself to charity projects, perhaps in an unconscious attempt to fill the void that tormented her. It was during one of these charity events, organized in a dilapidated part of the city, that her life began to take an unexpected turn. She was distributing supplies in a poor community when her eyes fixed on an elderly woman watching everything from a distance with a deep, penetrating gaze. There was something about that woman that piqued Amelia's curiosity. Perhaps it was the expression of wisdom mixed with sadness, or the way she seemed to recognize Amelia, even though they had never met before. The elderly woman, dressed in simple, worn-out clothes, stood out in that scene due to her distinct aura, as if she were out of place in time and space. Without thinking much, Amelia approached the woman. "Hello, my name is Amelia. Is there anything I can help you with?" The question came out more as a reflex of her obligation than a real intention, but the elderly woman's gentle smile softened her words. "You've already helped more than you realize, my dear," the woman replied, her voice softened with the weight of the years. "But perhaps I can offer you something in return, a bit of my story." Intrigued, Amelia accepted the invitation for a conversation. They sat on a nearby bench while the event continued to bustle around them. The elderly woman's name was Helen. She spoke with a calm cadence, as if each word was chosen with care. Gradually, the conversation began to reveal pieces of a past that, for Amelia, was both unknown and painfully familiar. Helen mentioned that she had worked for many years as a housekeeper, taking care of an old estate. When Amelia asked more about this job, Helen looked away for a moment, as if pondering how much she should reveal. "It was a big, beautiful house, but it wasn't mine. It belonged to a family that valued power and appearances above all else." Helen's words echoed in Amelia's mind. Something inside her began to stir, a feeling she couldn't ignore. "And why did you leave that house?" Amelia asked, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Helen sighed, her distant eyes seeming to see beyond the present to a time that had long been forgotten. "Sometimes love forces us to make difficult decisions, my dear. Decisions that can take us away from everything we know, from everyone we love. But there are no regrets, only lessons." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine at those words. She had never considered that love could be stronger than duty, more powerful than the very desire to keep a family's image intact. At that moment, she realized there was much more to that elderly woman than met the eye. As the afternoon began to fade, Amelia said goodbye to Helen, promising to return soon for another visit. But as she returned to her luxurious apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about the elderly woman. There was a connection there, something she couldn't yet define, but that was drawing her closer to that story. In the days that followed, Amelia found herself increasingly drawn to her conversations with Helen. The elderly woman, in turn, seemed to be testing the waters, revealing small fragments of her life but always maintaining an air of mystery. Amelia began to investigate Helen's past on her own, trying to find any clues that might explain the strange connection she felt. Then, one rainy night, while rummaging through old documents in her home's library, Amelia found a yellowed photograph hidden among the pages of an accounting book. It was an old photo showing a young woman standing next to a smiling man, both holding hands in a lush garden. The woman, with her dark hair and delicate face, was unmistakable. Amelia recognized her instantly. It was Helen, her Helen. Amelia held the photo with trembling hands, feeling her heart race. This discovery shook her beliefs and her view of her own family. Helen was more than just a lonely elderly woman. She was a vital part of the Townsend family's history, a part that had been deliberately erased. That night, Amelia knew she would have to confront the truth, regardless of the consequences. She could no longer ignore the past, no longer hide behind the walls of her mansion and pretend her life was perfect. Helen, the woman who intrigued her so much, was her grandmother, and now it was up to Amelia to decide what to do with this revelation. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside Amelia, an even greater storm was beginning to form. Amelia spent the night awake, holding the photo in her hands and trying to organize her thoughts. How could no one have mentioned Helen's existence before? Why had her grandmother been erased from the family's history as if she had never existed? More and more, Helen's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't stop thinking about the forbidden love her grandmother had mentioned. The next morning, Amelia made a decision. She needed to confront her father and get answers. Charles Townsend was a man of few words and a firm temperament. He had never shown weakness and was rarely seen out of control. Since his wife's death, he had devoted himself entirely to the family business, keeping himself distant from any emotional involvement. Amelia knew the confrontation would be difficult, but she was determined to discover the truth. When she came down for breakfast, she found her father in the dining room reading the newspaper as usual. He looked up when he saw her, offering a formal smile, which she returned nervously. "Father, can we talk?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Charles lowered the newspaper, sensing the serious tone in his daughter's voice. "Of course, Amelia. Did something happen?" She hesitated for a moment but decided to go straight to the point. "I found something last night, an old photo of a woman I met recently. Her name is Helen." At the mention of the name, Charles's expression changed instantly. He frowned, his surprise quickly turning into a mask of indifference. "Where did you find her?" he asked, not taking his eyes off his daughter. "She lives in a poor neighborhood in the city. I met her at a charity event, and by chance I discovered that she's my grandmother." The last word came out as a whisper, but carried a heavy weight. Charles let out a deep sigh, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Amelia, there are things about our family that were buried for a reason. Helen made her choices, and we—" "What choices?" Father Amelia asked, her voice growing firmer. "Why didn't you ever tell me about her? Why was she cast out of the family?" Charles stood up from his chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the well-kept garden of the mansion. "Helen chose a path that took her away from us. She got involved with someone who wasn't suitable, someone who wasn't on our level. When she decided to go through with it, she lost the right to be a Townsend. She was in love." Father Amelia retorted, feeling the anger rise within her. "And for that, I was cast out for loving someone who didn't fit the standards of our family." Charles turned to her, his eyes hardened. "Amelia, you don't understand. Back then, the family's reputation was everything. If we hadn't acted, the scandal would have destroyed everything we had built." "But at what cost?" Amelia challenged, feeling her voice rise. "You banished her from our lives, deprived me of knowing my own grandmother, and all because of pride and reputation. Is that what really matters?" Charles remained silent for a long moment before speaking again, this time in a lower, darker tone. "It wasn't just reputation, Amelia. The man Helen loved, he brought shame and misery. He ruined her life, and he almost ruined ours too." Amelia was stunned by her father's words. He was hiding something more, something he hadn't yet revealed. But before she could ask, Charles abruptly ended the conversation. "Enough, Amelia. We won't talk about this anymore. Helen made her choice, and now you need to make yours. She is not part of this family." Amelia felt her stomach churn. She was furious not just with her father but with the entire notion of what her family represented. With a sharp movement, she left the dining room, leaving her father alone with his thoughts. On her way back to her luxurious apartment, Amelia felt tears burn in her eyes. Everything she thought she knew about her family was unraveling. The perfect image that had been built over the years was a sham, based on lies and secrets. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't let Helen continue living forgotten and ignored. Determined, Amelia grabbed her phone and called her driver. "Take me to the address I gave you yesterday, now." She knew she needed to see Helen to confront her with what she had discovered and to decide how to move forward. When she arrived at Helen's modest apartment, the elderly woman opened the door with a welcoming smile, but the smile faded when she saw the serious expression on Amelia's face. "What happened, dear?" Helen asked, her voice trembling with concern. Amelia hesitated for a moment, but then she pulled the photo from her pocket and handed it to Helen. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me find out on my own?" Helen looked at the photo for a long time, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I thought it would be better this way. I didn't want to complicate your life or bring up things that were buried so long ago." "But you're my grandmother," Amelia said, her voice breaking. "I deserve to know." Helen sighed, holding the photo with trembling hands. "I did what I thought was right at the time, but now I see that I deprived you of something important, and for that I'm sorry." Amelia sat next to Helen, trying to process everything. What really happened? Why were you cast out? Helen closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to relive the past. "I fell in love with James, the gardener on our estate. He was a good man, honest, but of humble origin. Our family didn't accept that, They gave me an ultimatum. Either I gave him up or I would be banished forever. I chose love, Amelia. I chose to live with James, even knowing that it meant losing everything I knew. Amelia felt a wave of compassion for Helen, but also anger at the cruelty of her family. And then what happened to him? Helen swallowed hard, the tears now falling freely. James fell ill shortly after we ran away. He died in my arms, leaving me alone in this world. Since then, I've lived with the ghost of what we lost, of what could have been. Helen's words hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. The pain of loss, of sacrifice, of a love that never had the chance to blossom, it was all there in the fragile figure of her grandmother. I want to help you, Helen, Amelia said with determination. I want to reconnect you with the world that was taken from you. You're not alone anymore. Helen looked at Amelia, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. You're so much like your mother, she whispered, so strong and determined. I knew you were special from the first time I saw you. Amelia smiled, feeling that she was finally finding her true place in the world alongside Helen. Let's do this together, Grandma. Let's reclaim what was lost and show the world that love is stronger than any secret or lie. Helen nodded but still seemed uncertain. You know what this means, don't you? It will stir up a lot of things, revive painful memories, and your father, he won't take this easily. I know, Amelia replied with defiance, but it's the right thing to do, and I won't let fear or pride stop us from moving forward. You're brave, Amelia, Helen said, squeezing her granddaughter's hand, much braver than I ever was. I'm proud of you, my dear. The two women embraced, sealing a silent pact of promise that the past would no longer cast a shadow over their lives. Amelia felt the strength of Helen's embrace, and in that moment, she understood what really mattered, the connection between them, the love that transcended time, and the barriers imposed by society. Let's start anew, Helen, Amelia said, looking into her grandmother's eyes. Let's create a new chapter for our family, one that values love and truth above all else. Helen smiled, her wrinkles softening as hope began to bloom in her heart. Yes, my dear. Let's do this together. As Amelia left Helen's apartment that night, she felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to face any challenge alongside her grandmother. However, as she walked through the rain-soaked streets, one last question lingered in her mind. What else was her family hiding? She felt there were more secrets buried, waiting to be unearthed, and of one thing Amelia was certain: she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the whole truth. And so, the first chapter of Amelia and Helen's new story closes with the certainty that a new beginning awaits. Amelia couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she had with Helen, the revelation that her grandmother, the woman who had been erased from her family's history, was still alive and had been exiled for love, deeply unsettled her. In the days following the encounter, a sense of restlessness took over her mind, and she realized she needed to do something more. Reconnecting with Helen wasn't enough. Amelia wanted to understand the full truth behind her grandmother's estrangement, and why her father, Charles, was so determined to keep this story buried. Determined to uncover more, Amelia began investigating on her own. She spent hours digging through old files, combing through the towns and mansions, visiting libraries, and talking to longtime employees who might have some information about the family's past. She knew what she was doing was risky. Directly challenging the silence her father had imposed could have serious consequences, but her need for answers was stronger than her fear. That afternoon, Amelia decided to visit the old family estate where Helen had worked and fallen in love with James. The mansion was several hours away from the city, surrounded by dense forests and verdant fields. The property had been closed for years since her grandfather's death, and Amelia had never set foot there before. She hoped the visit might give her a new perspective on Helen's life and what really happened back then. The journey to the property was quiet and somber. The tall trees cast long shadows on the road, and the cloudy sky contributed to the melancholic mood. When the car finally stopped in front of the old mansion, Amelia felt a chill down her spine. The house was imposing, with its classical architecture and once exuberant gardens now overgrown with weeds. It was as if time had stopped there, preserving a piece of the past. Amelia stepped out of the car and walked to the main entrance. The heavy wooden door was locked, but she had the key inherited from her grandfather. With a dry click, the door opened and Amelia entered, smelling the musty odor of dust hanging in the air. The mansion's interior was grand, but the neglect was evident. Furniture covered with white sheets, crooked paintings on the walls, and the absolute silence gave the house an almost ghostly aspect. She walked slowly through the halls, trying to imagine what life was like in that mansion when Helen still lived there. Every room seemed to tell a different story, but all shared the same feeling of loneliness and longing. When Amelia reached the back garden, the place where Helen and James had likely spent many moments together, she felt a wave of emotion. The garden was in ruins. The flowers had withered, and the stone statues were covered in moss, but she could feel the presence of the love that once flourished there. She knelt by a bed of roses, touching the dry petals. I'm going to restore this, Amelia murmured to herself, feeling a renewed determination. "I'm going to bring this place back to life in honor of you, Helen, and the love you and James shared." As she walked back to the house, something caught her attention. It was a small cabin hidden among the trees at the back of the garden. Amelia approached and realized the cabin was locked, but the door looked old and fragile. Pushing it with some force, she managed to open a small gap, enough to enter. The cabin's interior was simple and rustic, with wooden furniture and few decorations. However, what most caught Amelia's attention was an old trunk covered in dust in the corner of the room. She knelt in front of it, feeling her heart race as she opened the lid. Inside, she found old letters, yellowed with age, and a photo of Helen and James together, smiling as if there was no worry in the world. Amelia picked up one of the letters and began to read it. It was a love letter written by James to Helen, filled with passionate words and promises of a future together. Amelia felt tears fill her eyes as she continued reading, feeling like an intruder in such an intimate moment, but at the same time, unable to stop. The last letter in the trunk, however, was different from the others. It was marked with dark stains, as if someone had cried while writing it. "My dear Helen," the letter began, "I'm sorry for bringing you so much pain. If I could go back, I'd do it all again because I can't imagine my life without you. But I know our love brought consequences we could never have foreseen. Promise me that if something happens to me, you'll move on. You deserve the world, Helen, and even if I'm not there to see it, I want you to know that I'll always love you." Amelia felt a sharp pang in her heart as she finished reading. James knew their love would bring hardships, but he was willing to face everything for Helen. And now, so many years later, Helen still lived with the scars of that love. Suddenly, Amelia heard a noise outside the cabin. Someone was approaching. She quickly put the letters back into the trunk and hid behind an old wardrobe. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, and Amelia held her breath. "Who's there?" a deep, familiar voice echoed through the small space. It was Charles, her father. He stood in the cabin's entrance, his eyes scanning the room for something or someone. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. He couldn't find her there, or he would discover what she was up to. For a moment, Charles seemed to hesitate, his eyes falling on the open trunk in the corner of the room. But instead of approaching, he let out a deep sigh and closed the door, leaving the cabin and returning to the mansion. Amelia waited until she was sure he was gone before emerging from her hiding place. Her hands trembled as she closed the trunk again. She knew she was playing with fire, but Charles's visit only reinforced her determination. There was much more to be discovered, and she wouldn't stop until she knew the whole truth. As she left the cabin, Amelia took one last look at the ruined garden. She had a plan. She would restore the garden, bring Helen back to the mansion, and together they would unearth all the secrets her family had tried so hard to bury. She knew this might put her relationship with her father at risk, but she was willing to face the consequences. In the following days, Amelia began putting her plan into action. She hired a team of gardeners to restore the mansion's garden, instructing them to follow the original plan she had found in the property's archives. She oversaw every detail, determined to bring back the beauty and life that once inhabited that place. During this period, her visits to Helen became more frequent. Amelia felt she needed to prepare her grandmother for what was to come, but she wasn't sure how to approach the subject. Every time she tried to talk about the past, Helen seemed to close herself off, reluctant to relive the painful memories. Still, Amelia persisted, hoping that one day Helen would feel ready to face it all. Finally, after weeks of work, the garden was almost finished. The property was beginning to look more alive, as if it was waking up from a long sleep. On the morning when the garden would finally be revealed, Amelia decided it was time to bring Helen to see the result. She arrived at her grandmother's apartment early, finding Helen sitting in her rocking chair, looking out the window with a distant expression. "Good morning, Helen," Amelia said, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. "I have a surprise for you." Helen smiled softly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Amelia couldn't ignore. "You've been so good to me, Amelia, but I feel like there's something you're not telling me. What are you planning?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, but then she knelt beside Helen, holding her wrinkled hands. "I restored the garden of the old mansion, the one where you and James spent time together. It's beautiful, Helen, and I wanted you to see it." Helen was silent for a long time, her eyes brimming with unused tears. "You did this for me?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. "But why, Amelia? Why bring back so many painful memories?" "Because it's part of our history," Amelia replied firmly. "And because you deserve it, Helen. I don't want the past to keep haunting us. I want us to find peace together." Helen seemed too emotional to speak, so she just nodded, letting Amelia help her up. Together, they left the apartment and got into the car that would take them to the old mansion. The journey was silent, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was a silence filled with anticipation and perhaps cautious hope. Amelia glanced at Helen, who kept her eyes fixed on the road, but with the expression of someone lost in thoughts and old memories. When the car finally arrived at the property, Helen took a deep breath. Amelia watched as her grandmother looked around, taking in every detail of the place that had once been her home. As they got out of the car, Amelia noticed Helen hesitating, as if unsure whether she should go on. "It's okay," Amelia said gently, extending her hand to her. "I'm with you." Helen took Amelia's hand, and together they walked toward the garden. As they passed through the entrance, the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a soft light over the place. The flowers were blooming again, the stone paths had been cleared, and the water fountains were working once more. It was as if the garden had regained the soul it had lost over the years. Helen stopped when she saw it all. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked around, absorbing the transformation. "It's beautiful, so beautiful," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "I wanted you to have a place where you could remember James happily," Amelia said, trying to hold back her own emotions. "A place where your love can live on forever." Helen smiled through her tears, squeezing Amelia's hand. "You did this for us. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Amelia replied. "I just want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever happened in the past, we'll face it together." Helen nodded, but Amelia could see that, as grateful as she was, the weight of the past still lingered over her. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this," Helen admitted, looking at the garden as if seeing ghosts from a time she could no longer touch. "There are so many things I'd rather forget, but maybe it's time to leave the past behind." Amelia suggested gently, "You told me that love sometimes forces us to make difficult decisions. Maybe now it's time to accept that love can also heal us." Helen looked at Amelia, her gaze filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "You're so wise, my dear. Maybe I underestimated the power love can have. Even after everything, I wouldn't have been able to do this without you." Amelia responded, "You taught me that love is worth it, even if it brings difficulties. I want you to help me restore our family's honor, starting with your legacy." Helen hesitated, but then, with a deep sigh, she nodded. "If that's what you want, I'll stand by your side, Amelia. I'm tired of running from the past. Maybe it's time to face it once and for all." Amelia smiled, and together they began to walk through the garden. They passed by beds of roses along stone paths, leading to hidden corners where nature seemed to keep old secrets. It was easy to imagine Helen and James there, young and in love, dreaming of a future that never came to be. "He used to bring me here to escape everything," Helen said after a while, as if reminiscing. "It was our refuge, where we could be ourselves away from judging eyes. I loved every second I spent with him, even knowing our love wouldn't be accepted." "He seemed like an amazing man," Amelia said, trying to imagine the strength of that forbidden love. "He was," Helen replied with a sad smile. "James had a pure soul. He didn't care what others thought, he just wanted me to be happy. But in the end, the weight of the world fell on us. Losing him was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and part of me never recovered." Amelia felt a lump in her throat hearing Helen's words. "I can't change what happened, Helen, but I can help preserve his memory. And I want you to know that your story, the story of you two, won't be forgotten." They continued exploring the garden until they reached a small stone fountain, where Helen paused. She knelt beside the fountain, running her fingers through the clear water, and closed her eyes as if in prayer. "James and I used to sit here and talk about the future," Helen said in a low voice. "He promised me that one day we would build a life together, far from all this, but fate had other plans." Amelia knelt beside Helen, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know nothing will erase the pain of loss, but I hope this can bring you some peace." Helen opened her eyes and looked at Amelia, her smile trembling. "It already has, my dear. It already has." As the day wore on, Amelia and Helen stayed in the garden, talking about the past and the future, about love and loss, about the life they both wanted to build. From that moment on, time seemed to stop for them, and the garden, now revitalized, had become a sanctuary where they could share their pain and hopes. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in golden and orange tones, Helen stood up and took one last look at the garden. "I think I'm ready to go back," she said, with a tone of determination in her voice. "And I think I'm ready to talk about what happened." Amelia nodded, feeling that this was the beginning of a new phase for both of them. "We'll face this together, Helen. No matter what the future brings, we'll face it all together." Helen smiled, a smile full of affection and strength. "Yes, my dear, together." As they left the garden and walked back to the mansion, Amelia knew that the true journey was just beginning. They would still have to confront Charles and the secrets he insisted on keeping hidden. But now, with Helen by her side, she felt stronger and more determined than ever. The past would no longer cast a shadow over them. Amelia and Helen were ready to face it and finally find the peace and love that they both deserved. The sunlight streaming through the restored windows of the mansion seemed to warm every corner, as if it were welcoming the new life that was beginning to fill the place. Amelia felt satisfied as she watched the transformation of the property, but she knew that the physical changes were just the beginning. The true restoration needed to happen within the hearts of her family, and for that, It was necessary to uncover all the secrets that had corroded it from within over the years. While supervising the final details of the renovation, Amelia noticed Charles's presence, observing the work in silence. Her father seemed tense, more rigid than usual, as if he was uncomfortable in that place that symbolized so much of the family's past. "Is everything okay?" Father Amelia asked, approaching him. Charles averted his gaze, fixing it on the newly restored garden. "You've been very dedicated to this project," he said, without answering the question directly. "But I wonder if all this is really necessary." "Why wouldn't it be?" Amelia responded, trying to stay calm. "It's our history, Father. What happened here is part of who we are." "Some parts of the past are better left buried," Charles replied, with a coldness that made Amelia flinch. "You're stirring up things that should remain forgotten." Amelia felt the anger bubbling inside her, but she tried to control her emotions. "I don't agree, Father. We can't keep pretending these things never happened. Helen has the right to be part of our family, and I'm not going to let her be erased from our history." Charles turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "You don't understand, Amelia. I did what was necessary to protect this family. If you knew everything that happened, you wouldn't be so determined to bring it all to light." "Then tell me," Father Amelia challenged, crossing her arms. "Tell me everything." "I don't know, because so far all I see is that Helen was cast out for loving someone who didn't fit our family standards. Is that what you call protection?" Charles was silent for a moment, as if deciding how much he should reveal. "It's not that simple," he finally said. "James, the man Helen loved, brought more than just dishonor to our family. He got involved in dangerous things that threatened not just Helen but all of us." Amelia frowned. "What are you talking about? What did James do?" "He got involved with the wrong people," Charles replied, his voice low, almost as if confessing a sin. "Men who dealt in dark businesses, who were willing to use any means to achieve their goals. James crossed their path, and we almost paid the price for it." "Is this true?" Amelia asked, feeling increasingly confused. "Or is it just an excuse to justify what you did to Helen?" "It's true," Charles replied with a hardness in his voice. "James put all of us in danger, and when Helen chose to stand by his side, I had no choice but to cast her out. I couldn't risk the safety of our family." Amelia felt the weight of her father's words, but there was still something that didn't make sense. If he was so dangerous, why didn't Helen ever talk about it? Why didn't she ever tell me what really happened? Maybe because she never knew the truth, Charles suggested, or maybe because she didn't want to believe that the man she loved was capable of putting everyone at risk. Either way, the past should stay in the past. There's nothing we can do to change it. Amelia looked at her father, feeling a mix of pity and frustration. "I can't just ignore this, Father. I need to know the whole truth, not just the parts you find convenient." Charles let out a deep sigh, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I did what I thought was right, Amelia. You may not understand now, but one day maybe you will." Before Amelia could respond, Charles walked away, heading back inside the mansion. She stood there, trying to process what she had just heard. There were more buried secrets than she had imagined, and the feeling that something terrible was still waiting to be revealed haunted her. That night, Amelia returned to Helen's apartment, determined to learn more about what had really happened. She needed to hear her grandmother's version of events to understand the full picture. When she entered, she found Helen sitting at the kitchen table, deep in her own thoughts. "Helen, can we talk?" Amelia asked, trying not to sound too anxious. Helen looked at her granddaughter, noticing the tension in her voice. "Of course, dear. What happened?" Amelia sat down next to her, holding her hands. "I talked to my father today. He told me more about what happened with James, and I need to understand your side of the story." Helen frowned, clearly surprised. "He actually talked about it. I always thought he preferred to pretend James never existed." "He mentioned that James got involved with dangerous people," Amelia began, watching Helen's reaction closely, "that he put the family in danger somehow. Is that true?" Helen was silent for a moment, processing the question. "I knew James had enemies," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but he never told me the details. He said he was trying to sort everything out, that I didn't need to worry. But now, looking back, I realize he was trying to protect me." "What do you think really happened?" Amelia asked, feeling like she was getting closer to something important. "I don't know," Helen replied with deep sadness in her voice. "James was a good man, but I think he got involved in something bigger than he could handle. There were always people around him, people who seemed interested in taking advantage of his kindness and naivety, but I never knew how dangerous it could be." Amelia felt a tightness in her chest hearing Helen's words. "So you didn't know what he was up against?" "Not completely," Helen answered, shaking her head. "But I loved him, Amelia, and I was willing to face anything by his side. When the family gave me that ultimatum, I didn't hesitate. I chose love. But now I wonder if I made the right choice." "You followed your heart," Amelia said, trying to comfort her, "and that's what matters." Helen smiled sadly, squeezing Amelia's hand. "You're very much like him, you know, determined, courageous, sometimes even stubborn. Amelia laughed softly. I like to think I inherited those qualities from you. Helen gave a slight smile but soon returned to seriousness. Amelia, there's something I need to tell you, something I've kept all these years and I think it's time you knew. Amelia felt her heart race. What is it, Helen? Helen took a deep breath before beginning. After James died, I found out I was pregnant. I had his child, a boy. But the family never accepted that. They took the baby from me, said he could never be a Townsend, and he was given up for adoption. I never saw him again. Helen's words hit Amelia like a sledgehammer. You had a child. I have an uncle I never knew. Helen nodded, tears falling from her eyes. Yes, and to this day I don't know where he is, or if he knows who he really is. Amelia was speechless. Everything she thought she knew about her family was being turned upside down. The idea that she had an uncle who should have been part of her life was something Amelia couldn't ignore. I'm going to find him, Amelia said with determination. I promise. No matter what, I'm going to find him. Helen looked at her granddaughter with a mix of hope and fear. I always wanted to find him, but I never had the courage. Now, with you by my side, maybe I can. We'll do this together, Amelia said, feeling more determined than ever. We'll find my uncle and bring him back to the family. No matter how long it takes or how many obstacles we face, I promise I won't give up until we bring him home. Helen looked deep into Amelia's eyes, feeling the warmth of her granddaughter's determination. I never thought anyone in the Townsend family would say that, Helen murmured, her voice choked with emotion. You're different, Amelia. You have a heart that doesn't let itself be corrupted by power or pride. I just hope this search doesn't hurt you more than it already hurt me. Amelia squeezed Helen's hand, her heart full of compassion. I know it will be hard, but I need to do this for you, for me, for him, for all of us. We need answers, and more than that, we need redemption. Helen nodded slowly, and the two remained silent for a while, each absorbing the weight of what was to come. The search for this lost uncle wouldn't be simple, but Amelia was prepared to face any adversity. She knew that with Helen by her side, she would have the strength to move forward. The next day, Amelia began investigating how she could find Helen's son. She knew that with the power and resources at her disposal, she had a better chance than anyone of uncovering the truth. However, she also knew that this search would require discretion. The last thing she wanted was to draw unwanted attention or, worse, alert her father to what she was doing. Amelia started by contacting a private investigator known for handling delicate family matters. She explained the situation, emphasizing the need for confidentiality, and provided all the information Helen had given her. The investigator, a seasoned professional named Mark Lawson, assured her that he would do everything in his power to find Helen's son. Over the next few weeks, Amelia kept herself busy with the final touches on the mansion's restoration and her charity work, all while anxiously awaiting news from Mark. She continued to visit Helen regularly, though they both knew that their conversations now held an underlying tension, a shared anticipation of what might come. Finally, one evening, Mark called Amelia. I think I found something, he said, his voice serious. It wasn't easy, but I managed to track down some adoption records from the time your uncle would have been born. There's a strong possibility that your uncle was adopted by a family in a small town a few hours away from here. Amelia's heart raced. Do you have a name? Any information about where he is now? His name was changed after the adoption, Mark explained. He was renamed David Collins. I've also found an address where he lived as a child, and I've discovered that he's currently living in the same town, working as a school teacher. Amelia felt a wave of emotions, relief, excitement, fear all at once. Thank you, Mark. This is more than I could have hoped for. Just remember, Mark, she cautioned, this is going to be a delicate situation. If you decide to contact him, you need to be prepared for any kind of reaction. He may not know anything about his real family, or he might have lived his whole life with certain beliefs that could be hard to change. I understand, Amelia replied, but I need to meet him to tell him the truth. He deserves to know. After hanging up the phone, Amelia immediately went to see Helen. She found her grandmother in her usual spot, looking out the window, but this time there was an unmistakable air of hope around her. I have news, Amelia said as she sat down next to Helen. Mark found him. Your son, my uncle. His name is David Collins now, and he's living in a small town not too far from here. Helen gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as tears welled up in her eyes. David, my David, she whispered, her voice filled with both joy and pain. Amelia took her hand, squeezing it gently. We can go see him, Helen. We can tell him the truth that he's part of our family. Helen looked at Amelia, her eyes searching her granddaughter's face for reassurance. Do you think he'll want to meet us? Do you think he'll want to know the truth after all these years? I don't know, Amelia admitted, but I think we owe it to him to try. We owe it to him to let him decide what he wants to do with the information, and no matter what happens, you won't be alone in this. I'll be with you every step of the way. Helen nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long, Amelia, but now that it's here, I'm so afraid of what he'll think of me, of how he'll react. I don't want to lose him again." "You're not going to lose him," Amelia said firmly. "Not if I can help it. We'll go together, and we'll explain everything. He deserves to know that you never wanted to give him up, that you loved him then and still love him now." The next day, Amelia and Helen made the trip to the small town where David Collins lived. The town was quaint with tree-lined streets, a few local shops, and a peaceful atmosphere that seemed worlds away from the bustling city life Amelia was used to. They found the school where David worked, a modest building with children playing in the yard. Helen's hands trembled as they approached the school, and Amelia felt a surge of protectiveness for her grandmother. As they walked through the doors, she kept her arm around Helen's shoulders, offering her silent support. Inside, they were directed to David's classroom. Through the small window in the door, Amelia saw him for the first time, a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and a kind face. He was sitting at his desk, grading papers, completely unaware of the two women standing just outside. Helen hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. "That's him," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "My son. My son." Amelia gently knocked on the door, and David looked up, surprised to see them. "Can I help you?" he asked, standing up and walking toward the door. Amelia took a deep breath, stepping inside with Helen. "Mr. Collins, David, my name is Amelia Townsend, and this is Helen Townsend. We need to talk to you about something very important." David looked puzzled, glancing from Amelia to Helen and back again. "Townsend," he repeated, as if trying to place the name. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I know you." Helen stepped forward, her voice trembling. "David, I know this is going to sound strange, but I'm your mother." David blinked, clearly taken aback. "My mother?" He looked at Helen, then shook his head in disbelief. "That's not possible. My mother passed away years ago." "I think you must have the wrong person." "No," Helen said, her voice firmer now. "You were taken from me when you were a baby. I never wanted to give you up, but it was forced upon me. I've searched for you for years, and I only recently found out where you were." David's face showed a mix of emotions, confusion, skepticism, and a glimmer of something that looked like hope. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Why would I have been taken from you? Why wouldn't you have tried to find me sooner?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I was young and alone, and I didn't have the power to fight the people who took you away from me. But I never stopped loving you, David, not for a single day." Amelia stepped forward, trying to bridge the gap. "David, I know this is a lot to take in. I've learned more about my family's past in the last few weeks than I ever thought possible. I know this is overwhelming, but please just hear us out. We have proof, records, letters, photos that can explain everything." David hesitated, his expression softening as he looked at Helen. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. It's unbelievable. I've lived my whole life thinking my parents were the people who raised me. I don't know how to process this." "I understand," Helen said, reaching out tentatively. "I don't want to force anything on you. I just want you to know that I've always loved you and I've always wanted to find you." David looked into Helen's tearful eyes, and something in his own gaze shifted. The skepticism faded, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "Maybe we should talk," he said, his voice softer now. "I don't know what to believe, but I think I need to hear the whole story." Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, David," she said gratefully. "We'll take as much time as you need. This is your story as much as it is ours." The three of them found a quiet place to sit and talk away from the curious eyes of the students and staff. Amelia and Helen took turns explaining everything. Helen's love for James, the birth of David, and the cruel separation that followed. They shared the records and photos that Mark had uncovered, showing David the undeniable truth of his origins. As David listened, his initial shock and disbelief gave way to a deep, contemplative silence. When they finished, he sat quietly for a long time, absorbing everything he had just learned. "I don't know how to feel," David finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel like my whole life has been turned upside down." "I'm so sorry, David," Helen said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "I never wanted this for you. If I could change the past, I would. But all I can do now is hope that we can start fresh, that maybe you can find it in your heart to forgive me and give us a chance to get to know each other." David looked at Helen, his expression softening as he saw the pain and regret in her eyes. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "I can see that now. You did what you could, and you never gave up on me. I don't know what the future holds, but I'd like to try to get to know you." Helen's face broke into a tearful smile, and she reached out to hold David's hand. "Thank you, David. That's all I could ever ask for." Amelia watched the exchange, her heart full. She knew this was just the beginning, that there would be challenges ahead as they all navigated this new reality. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope and healing for her family. As they continued to talk, the initial tension slowly dissolved, replaced by a tentative warmth. David asked questions about his heritage, about the Townsend family, and about the life he might have had if things had been different. Helen answered as best she could, often with tears in her eyes, while Amelia provided context and reassured David that he was now, and had always been, an important part of their family. The conversation lasted well into the afternoon, with the three of them exchanging stories, memories, and feelings that had been buried for far too long. David shared details about his upbringing, his adoptive parents, and his life as a school teacher in the small town. It became clear that while his life had been simple, it had also been fulfilling in its own way. "I'm not angry," David finally admitted, his voice soft. "I think I'm more sad about what could have been, but I also realize that if things had been different, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I wouldn't have had the life I've lived. So I guess there's a balance to it all." Helen nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and acceptance. "I understand, David. I've thought about that too all these years, but just knowing you're here, knowing you're happy and safe, it means the world to me." Amelia, sensing the need to lighten the mood, smiled and said, "You know, David, you might have missed out on the Townsend mansion and all the so-called luxuries, but it sounds like you got something far more valuable, real happiness. And if you ever feel like visiting, I'm sure we could find a room or two for you." David chuckled, his laughter breaking the emotional intensity of the moment. "I might just take you up on that offer, Amelia. It would be interesting to see the place that's been at the center of all this history." Helen squeezed David's hand again, this time with a lighter heart. "You're always welcome, David. The doors will always be open to you whenever you want to walk through them." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the small town, David walked Amelia and Helen back to their car. They exchanged promises to stay in touch and to slowly build the relationship that had been denied to them for so long. "Thank you for finding me," David said to Amelia as they stood by the car. "I know it couldn't have been easy, but I'm glad you did. I'm glad I finally know the truth." Amelia smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and relief. "Your family, David, and family means everything to us. I'm just glad we found you." As they drove away, Helen remained quiet for a while, gazing out the window with a look of contentment. Finally, she turned to Amelia and said, "I never thought this day would come, Amelia. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever: hope." Amelia reached over and took Helen's hand. "It's only the beginning, Helen. We have a lot of time to make up for, and I'm going to be with you every step of the way." Back at the mansion, the air felt different. The heavy burden of secrets and lies that had weighed on the Townsend family for so long seemed lighter, as if the truth had begun to cleanse the very walls of the house. Charles noticed the change in Amelia, but he didn't ask about her trip. However, Amelia knew she couldn't avoid the inevitable confrontation forever. Her father had to know that they had found David, and that the family's future would no longer be dictated by the secrets of the past. One evening after a particularly tense family dinner, Amelia decided it was time. She found Charles in his study, reading over some documents, his usual stoic expression in place. "Father," Amelia began, her voice steady but firm, "I need to talk to you about something important." Charles looked up from his papers, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it, Amelia?" Amelia took a deep breath. "I found him. I found Helen's son, my Uncle David. He's alive and well, and we've made contact with him." For a moment, Charles's expression didn't change, but then a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or regret crossed his face. "You found him?" "Yes," Amelia confirmed. "And I've spoken to him. He knows the truth now about who he is and where he comes from. He's agreed to get to know us, to be part of our family." Charles was silent for a long time, his gaze distant as if he were processing the implications of this news. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I suppose this was inevitable. You were always determined to uncover the truth." "It's not just about the truth," Father Amelia said softly. "It's about healing. Our family has been fractured for too long by secrets and lies. We have a chance now to start fresh, to rebuild what's been broken." Charles looked at his daughter, his expression softer than she had seen in a long time. "And what do you expect from me, Amelia?" "To welcome him with open arms as if nothing happened." "I expect you to try," Amelia replied honestly. "I expect you to acknowledge that mistakes were made and that we can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. David didn't ask for any of this. He deserves a chance to know his family, and we deserve a chance to make things right." Charles was quiet again, but Amelia could see the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, he nodded, though it was a reluctant gesture. "I'll meet him, but I can't promise anything more than that." "That's all I ask," Amelia said, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. "I think you'll find that David is a good man, just like Helen always said." Charles didn't respond, but Amelia knew that this small concession was a victory in itself. She left the study feeling that, for the first time, her family was taking real steps toward healing and reconciliation. In the weeks that followed, Amelia and Helen worked on building a relationship with David. The process was slow, but it was filled with moments of joy and discovery. David visited the mansion, met other family members, and began to piece together the life that had been hidden from him for so long. As for Charles, he kept his distance at first, but gradually he began to show more interest. The day finally came when Charles and David sat down together, not as strangers but as family, and had a long, difficult conversation about the past. It was a conversation filled with honesty, apologies, and the beginnings of forgiveness. Amelia watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride and relief. The Townsend family was far from perfect, but they were moving in the right direction. They were healing, and that was all she could have hoped for. One evening, as Amelia walked through the restored garden, now full of life and color, Helen joined her. They strolled together in silence for a while, both of them reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. "This garden," Helen said softly, "it's more than just a place now. It's a symbol of everything we've been through and everything we've overcome." Amelia nodded, feeling the same sense of peace. "It's our legacy, Helen. A legacy of love, loss, and redemption, and it's just the beginning." Helen smiled, her face radiant with contentment. "Thank you, Amelia, for everything. You've given me back my family, my hope, and my future." Amelia turned to her grandmother, her eyes shining with emotion. "We did this together, Helen. We're stronger because we faced it all together." As they continued their walk, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the garden. The Townsend family had been through darkness, but now they were stepping into the light, ready to embrace the future with open hearts, and the knowledge that no matter what, they would always have each other. And for Amelia, that was the most precious legacy of all. The days passed with a sense of renewal and hope in the Townsend mansion. Amelia knew that things were far from perfect, but for the first time she saw the possibility of true reconciliation within her family. David's presence brought a new dynamic to the Townsend family. His initial hesitance gradually gave way to curiosity and a genuine desire to connect with the relatives he had only recently discovered. The process was slow and sometimes awkward, but it was clear that everyone was making an effort to bridge the gap that decades of separation had created. Amelia watched as her father, Charles, tried to navigate this new reality. Though he remained somewhat reserved, there were moments when his guard would drop and a more vulnerable side of him would show. He and David had several conversations, mostly centered around the family's history and the choices that had been made. These discussions were not always easy, but they were necessary steps toward healing old wounds. One evening, Amelia found herself in the library, going through some of the old family records. As she traced the lineage and stories of the Townsend family, she felt a sense of responsibility to preserve these histories, not just the glamorous parts, but the painful truths as well. It was part of understanding who they were as a family and where they were going. Helen entered the library quietly, taking a seat beside Amelia. "You've done so much to bring us all together," she said softly. "But how are you, Amelia? You've been carrying a lot on your shoulders." Amelia looked at her grandmother and smiled gently. "I'm doing okay, Helen. It's been a lot, but it's worth it. Seeing everyone come together despite everything makes it all worthwhile." Helen nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "You remind me so much of your mother. She always believed in the power of family, no matter how difficult things got." "I wish I could have known her better," Amelia said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I feel like through all of this, I've gotten to understand her more." "She would be so proud of you," Helen said, placing a hand on Amelia's. "You've taken on so much, and you've done it with grace and strength. You've given us all a second chance." Amelia squeezed Helen's hand, feeling a deep connection to the woman who had endured so much yet remained strong. "We've all played a part, Helen. I couldn't have done any of this alone." As the days turned into weeks, the Townsend family continued to heal. David became a regular visitor to the mansion, and his relationship with Helen grew stronger with each passing day. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other in a way that both had longed for but never thought possible. Charles, too, began to soften. He and David found common ground in their discussions about the family business, and there were moments when it seemed as if they were not just father and son-in-law, but friends. The tension that had once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced by mutual respect and understanding. Amelia, witnessing all these changes, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The family was not just surviving, they were growing, evolving into something stronger and more unified than they had been in years. But she knew that there was still one more step to take, one more person to bring fully into the fold. Amelia had yet to confront her father about the secrets he had kept, the choices he had made that had nearly torn their family apart. She knew that to truly move forward, they needed to address the past openly and honestly. One evening after dinner, Amelia asked Charles to join her in the library. He seemed to sense that this was not just a casual conversation, and he followed her with a serious expression. They sat down across from each other, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. Amelia took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. Father, she began, I want to talk about what happened all those years ago, about the decisions that were made and the secrets that were kept. Charles looked at her, his face impassive, but Amelia could see the tension in his posture. I've already told you everything, Amelia, he said quietly. I did what I thought was best for the family. I know you did, Amelia replied, but those decisions had consequences that we're still dealing with today. I'm not here to accuse you or to reopen old wounds, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the impact of those choices. Charles remained silent, his eyes focused on the floor. Amelia continued, her voice gentle but firm. I know you were trying to protect us, but in doing so you kept us from the truth, and that truth could have helped us heal sooner. Helen, David, and I have all been affected by the decisions that were made, and now I think it's time for us to face that together as a family. Charles finally looked up, his expression weary. What do you want me to say, Amelia? That I was wrong, that I should have done things differently. I'm not looking for an apology, Amelia said softly. I'm looking for understanding. I want us to move forward with open eyes, knowing that we've made mistakes, but also knowing that we're committed to doing better. This family has a chance to rebuild itself, to create a new legacy that's based on honesty and love, not secrets and fear. Charles sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. I've always tried to do what was right for this family, but I see now that maybe I was too focused on control, on maintaining an image, rather than on what truly mattered. Amelia reached out and took his hand. It's not too late, Father. We can change. We can be better. But we need to do it together. For a long moment, Charles simply held her gaze. Then, finally, he nodded a small but significant gesture of acceptance. You're right, Amelia. We can't keep living in the past. It's time to move forward. A sense of relief washed over Amelia as she squeezed her father's hand. They weren't perfect, and they still had a long way to go, but they were finally on the same page. The Townsend family was moving toward a future that was built on truth, understanding, and love. In the following months, the Townsend family embraced their new beginning. David became an integral part of the family, and his bond with Helen deepened with each passing day. The mansion, once a symbol of secrets and pain, now felt like a true home, a place where the past was acknowledged but not allowed to dictate the future. Amelia continued her work, both within the family and in her charitable endeavors. She felt more fulfilled than ever, knowing that she had played a key role in bringing her family back together. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. As the seasons changed and the first hints of winter began to appear, the Townsend family gathered once again in the mansion's grand hall. This time there were no secrets, no hidden pain, just a sense of unity and hope for the future. Charles stood beside Amelia, watching as David and Helen laughed together by the fireplace. He turned to his daughter, a rare smile on his face. You were right, Amelia, he said quietly. This family is stronger now than it ever was. Amelia smiled back, feeling a deep sense of contentment. We're stronger because we faced the truth, Father, and because we chose to love each other despite everything. Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'm proud of you, Amelia. You've shown me what it means to truly lead, to lead with heart and integrity. Amelia's heart swelled with pride. Thank you, Father. That means more to me than you know. As they stood together, watching the family they had worked so hard to heal, Amelia knew that they had finally found the peace they had been searching for. The Townsend family was whole again, ready to face the future with open hearts and a shared commitment to the love that had brought them back together. And for Amelia, that was the greatest victory of all. The months following Matthew and Helen's reunion were filled with emotional highs and lows. Although the first step had been taken, the path to full reconciliation was just beginning. Amelia played a crucial role, mediating conversations between them and ensuring that even when tensions rose, communication remained open. Matthew, still torn between resentment over the past and curiosity about his true origins, began visiting Helen regularly. The conversations were often difficult and emotionally charged, but there was progress. With each visit, they uncovered more about the man Matthew had become and the woman Helen had always been. One morning, while walking through the restored gardens of the Townsend mansion, Helen and Matthew shared a tender moment that marked an important turning point in their relationship. They stopped near the fountain where Helen and James, her great love, used to meet. The place had been revitalized, but it still held the energy of past moments. He was a good man, Helen said, looking at the shimmering water of the fountain. James loved me with all his heart, and his love gave me the strength to face everything that came afterward. But in the end, I lost you too, and that was a pain I never got over. Matthew was silent for a moment, absorbing Helen's words. He had always known something was missing in his life, a part of himself he never fully understood. I always felt like something was missing, he admitted, his voice softer than usual. I never knew what it was until now, but it's hard to accept that all this happened because of decisions I couldn't control. Helen nodded, the pain in her eyes evident. I know it's not easy, and I can't change what happened, but I can offer you something now. Something I've always wanted to give you, my love. My presence in your life. If you're willing to accept me, Matthew looked at Helen, seeing the sincerity in her face. For the first time, he allowed the barrier he had built over the years to start crumbling. He stepped forward and hesitantly embraced Helen. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder, "but I think I want to try." Helen closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the warmth of that embrace, something she had dreamed of her entire life. "That's all I ask," she said, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. As Matthew and Helen's relationship continued to develop, Amelia also went through a profound transformation. The revelations about her family had forced her to reevaluate her own priorities and the way she lived her life. She realized that for years she had been controlled by society's expectations and the values her father Charles had instilled in her since childhood. Amelia knew she needed to have one last conversation with Charles to resolve what had been left unsaid between them. One afternoon, she went to her father's study in the mansion, where he was working as usual, immersed in documents and spreadsheets. Seeing her enter, Charles looked up, surprised by his daughter's unexpected presence. "Amelia," he said, with a slight tone of apprehension in his voice, "is something wrong?" Amelia approached and sat down in the chair across from his desk. "Yes, father. I think we need to talk about everything that's happened and what it means for us." Charles sighed, closing the files he had been working on. "I thought this moment would come. You know, when you were a child, I always thought I was doing what was best for you, keeping the family together, protecting our name. But now I see that maybe I was wrong." Amelia felt a pang of sadness hearing the vulnerability in her father's voice. "I know you did what you thought was right, father, but in doing so you hid important things from us. You pushed Helen away, tried to erase James's memory, and nearly made us lose Matthew. That can't continue." Charles nodded, his tired eyes revealing the internal struggle he was facing. "I always thought I was protecting you, but in protecting the family, I think I ended up pushing away the people I love the most. Maybe now it's time to leave that behind." Amelia suggested gently, "Helen, Matthew, and I were trying to rebuild what was lost, but we need you to be a part of that too." Charles looked at Amelia, sensing the sincerity in her words. For the first time, he realized how far his need for control had taken his family. "I don't know if I can change everything I did," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "but I'll try. For you, for Helen, and for Matthew." Amelia smiled, feeling a wave of hope. "That's all we need, father. We'll face this together." Those words marked the beginning of a new era for the Townsend family. Although reluctant at first, Charles began to participate more actively in Helen and Matthew's lives. He still had his reservations, but he was willing to make room in his life for what truly mattered: family. The following months were filled with rebuilding and healing. Matthew continued to explore his relationship with Helen, and although there were moments of tension and doubt, both were committed to building something real. Amelia was the glue that held everyone together, always encouraging, always supporting, and over time, she saw the transformation of her family. The restoration of the Townsend mansion was finally completed, but the true renewal occurred within its walls. The secrets that once haunted the house were replaced by new, happy memories created by a family that was finally learning to love and accept each other, despite all the hardships. On a sunny autumn afternoon, the Townsend family organized a special event in the mansion's garden. It was a simple but meaningful celebration, a gathering of friends and relatives to mark the family's new phase. Helen and Matthew were together, talking and laughing, something that had seemed impossible just a few months ago. Charles, though still somewhat distant, observed the scene with a look that mixed pride and regret. Amelia, who was watching everything from afar, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she felt at peace knowing she had done everything in her power to bring her family back to what truly mattered. That night, as the party lights twinkled under the trees and laughter echoed through a garden, Helen approached Amelia, holding an envelope in her hands. "Amelia, I have something for you," she said with a smile full of emotion. Amelia took the envelope, curious. "What is this, Helen?" "A letter," Helen replied, her eyes shining with affection. "I wrote this letter right after you were born, but I never had the chance to give it to you. In fact, I kept it safe for when the right moment came, and I think now is that moment." Amelia carefully opened the envelope, finding an old piece of paper with Helen's delicate handwriting. The letter was a message of love, full of advice and wishes for Amelia's future, written by a woman who, even living in exile, always believed that love was the most powerful force in the world. As Amelia read, tears streamed down her face. She felt the depth of Helen's love, a love that had transcended time and difficulties. In that moment, she realized that despite everything, she had also found her true purpose, to unite her family and ensure that love prevailed over any secret pain or loss. When she finished reading the letter, Amelia looked at Helen, who was watching her with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Helen," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "for everything. I wouldn't be who I am today without you." Helen pulled Amelia into a tight embrace, feeling finally at peace. "And I couldn't have done it without you, my dear. You brought light to our family, and for that I will be eternally grateful." As they hugged under the starry sky, Amelia felt a deep serenity. Her journey had been arduous, full of challenges and painful revelations. But the ending was sweeter than she could have imagined. Her family was finally united. The love that Helen and James had shared, which had been tested by time and suffering, now flourished through their descendants. And so, with her heart full of love and hope, Amelia knew that no matter what the future held, they were ready to face it together as a true family.